who was the Buddha? In this video, I'll give a short introduction to his life and times. I'm Doug Smith of the online Dharma Institute, where you can find courses about the early Buddhist Dharma, including, in fact, a longer course on the Buddha's life if you want to learn more. If you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to this channel and click the bell down below if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. So who was the Buddha? Well, in a nutshell, he was the founder of what's now the fourth largest religion on earth. Or, depending on how you count these things, perhaps even the largest philosophy on earth, if we consider him a philosopher, because he can be thought of both ways. He was apparently born Siddhartha Gautama into a relatively wealthy family in the Shakya clan, which was a clan that lived in and around what is now present-day Lumbini, Nepal, which is right on the border with India. And he was born sometime around 480 BCE, at least that's as far as we can tell. His mother died soon after his birth, and so he was brought up by his father and his stepmother. And he lived a life of some luxury, at least according to the standards of the time, and seems to have been somebody who was interested in doing meditation and somebody who was skilled at it, who had a certain kind of precocious ability at being able to meditate at a young age. That said, he seems to have become disillusioned with this life of pleasure when he was entering his adulthood. He seems to have gotten interested and obsessed about the possibilities of old age, of sickness, and of death, and trying to find a way out of it, trying to find a way out of these problems that beset all of humanity. And he was aware that this life of pleasure that he had was not something that could continue, that eventually he was going to have to leave it behind, either because of sickness again, or of old age, or of death. So he saw this inherent stress or tension between the pleasures of his life and the dangers that were lying ahead of him. And so this tension eventually got to a point where he decided he had to leave home in order to enter the forest and find answers to these questions on his own. So eventually he decided to leave his parents and his family and set off. And in doing so, he was following the same route as many different what are called renunciants were doing at the time, and indeed for centuries before in India. That is, people would retire into the forest to try to find answers to these kinds of deep spiritual questions. They would separate themselves from society and live on the margins of society, trying to find out the depth of these kind of questions about wisdom. And this was a time of deep philosophical ferment in ancient India. Many different teachers and schools and ideas were vying for attention. Many different ideas around that the Buddha entertained and thought about. And so, and I should say, this is very much like the same thing that was happening in ancient Greece at the same time, this kind of philosophical ferment. But the difference in India was that there was a very deep history of meditative insight, that is, insight gotten through deep meditative practice. And the Buddha followed that path, indeed trying to look for the greatest meditation teachers of his day. And he looked to two of them, one after the other. These were teachers of yogic techniques. They seem to have been Brahminic teachers who taught deep states of meditative absorption that were supposed to help unify oneself or one's soul with the universal principle of Brahman. In other words, that these were teachers who were teaching that through deep meditation, one could gain knowledge that oneself was identical with the universe in some sense. That is, these practices were practices that would get us away from the world of the senses and of ordinary pleasures to a deeper understanding, a deeper awareness or insight into our unity with reality. However, the Buddha-to-be, Gautama, did not believe that these techniques were worthwhile. He didn't believe that they led to enlightenment, so he left them behind and turned towards a different series of practices that were propounded by a different group of teachers. And these were teachings of severe ascetic practices that involved pain, essentially trying to burn away our attachment to the senses, burn away our attachment to pleasures through painful austerities. And this was the teaching of what we believe would be the Jains of the time. Jainism was a religion that was around before the Buddha's lifetime and indeed persists in India down to this day. And so the Buddha went through a long period of trying out these Jain ascetic techniques. But at the end of it, he realized that they also didn't work, that they also did not lead to enlightenment. He came to a realization that the pleasures that he got through his normal meditative practice were not problematic. They didn't need to be burned away. They weren't the sorts of things that he should be concerned about. And he also realized that the ordinary life of eating enough to survive, living an ordinary life that was not self-indulgent, but also not full of penance and so on, full of painful austerities, that this middle path was the best way forward, a middle path between, again, sensual indulgence and painful austerity. That was the best way forward. And so having understood that, he got to a particular place. He says, "I saw an agreeable piece of ground, a delightful grove with a clear-flowing river, with pleasant smooth banks and a nearby village for alms resort." That is, he was aware that this beautiful place to sit down was close to a village that he could gain food. The way that these renunciants fed themselves was through alms, was through going to the local towns and asking for food. That way they could remain outside of society, but still close enough to gain food from them, but could teach the society in the same way, and this will come to this in a moment. In any event, having made that decision, he sat down and, through a period of time, was able to attain enlightenment, whereby he was able to, he says, end his own tendencies towards greed, towards hatred, and towards ignorance. In other words, ignorance with the way the world really works. And having done that, he began formulating the Dharma that would become his teaching. And indeed, for the rest of his life, another 40-some-odd years, he would be teaching the insights that he gained on that day. And he also taught about how to achieve those same insights for ourselves. Now, I won't go into all of his insights here on this video. It would end up being an enormous video, but in a very small nutshell, they include things like the Four Noble Truths, like the Eightfold Path, like dependent origination. His practices include such things as mindfulness of breathing, as the four jhanas, that is, deep states of meditative absorption and how we achieve them, and practices such as loving kindness, or what are known as the Brahma Viharas, these ways that we foster in ourselves healthy emotional states. All of these practices are meant to drive us towards those insights if we do them in the proper way. And indeed, many of the videos, in fact, most of the videos on this channel deal with one or another aspect of these teachings of the Buddha, either the doctrine that he discovered and formulated, or the practices that he recommended. Both of these are critical to our understanding of the Buddha's teaching. What was he like as a person or as a teacher? Well, his personality was such that he was apparently a very accomplished debater. He was very good at debates with other people, but he was not particularly interested in debating them in the sense that he would not go looking for a debate. He was not the sort of person who would go out searching out somebody to argue with. Instead, he would wait until they came to him, and if somebody came to him and wished to argue about a particular topic, he was quite open about doing so. He was quite accomplished at doing so. Many of the early suttas depict him this way. However, he was also somebody who loved quiet, who didn't like the hullabaloo, the discussion of normal monastic life, of having people around, shall we say, and talking and chattering. Instead, he preferred the quiet of meditative insight, of meditative practice. And so we see something of a dichotomy here, of being somebody who loves quiet but also is willing to and able to debate. He was also somebody who was very philosophically pragmatic and practical. He was not so interested in many of the deeper questions that many of his colleagues and competitors seem to have been exercised about. Instead, the Buddha was most interested in finding out techniques and beliefs, understanding that would help us to overcome suffering, to overcome the difficulties of life. And simply knowing something to know it was not enough for the Buddha. So it might be something that was very interesting, some speculative kind of fact about the world. The Buddha didn't really care about those and didn't teach them so much. He was a teacher who was clearly very compassionate. He was out for limiting the suffering of people who listened to him. But he was also very tough. He was very quick to criticize a monastic who got wrong something that he had taught. If he taught something and a monastic disagreed with him or said that he had not taught that, he was very tough with them. He was very strong with them. He had a kind of we might say, sort of a fatherly kind of approach to his teaching, one that was both compassionate and tough. And he seems to have been an extremely charismatic person and extremely attuned to the personalities of the people around him, who knew very easily how to tailor a particular teaching to his audience. And perhaps his greatest accomplishment was the creation of the Monastic Sangha. This is perhaps the oldest in the world that remains to this day. The oldest human institution that remains to this day is the Monastic Sangha that the Buddha set up now over 2,500 years ago. And he set this up in order to retain his teachings faithfully and propagate them. And to do that, he set up both a male Sangha and a female Sangha. That is to say, male monastics and female monastics. And set them up in such a way that they had to remain, or were supposed to remain, in close contact with the lay community, as I mentioned a while back. That is, the monastics were not allowed to feed themselves. They had to ask for alms from the lay community. And this was in order to set up a kind of reciprocal relationship with the lay community, such that the lay community provided the monastics with food and with lodging and with clothing and medicine. And in turn, the monastics provided the lay community with teachings, with the Dharma, with a wise understanding of how to live a good and ethical life. And this way, the monastic Sangha was not going to become out of touch with the broader society in which it resided. I think the Buddha was very concerned about that the monastics not simply retire into the forest by themselves, because that would be a sort of a dead-end practice. Instead, they were supposed to remain intimately interacting with the world around them. He also believed in active proselytization. That is, he told many monastics, to go off into far reaches of the countryside around, into places that he would not have gone otherwise, in order to teach the Dharma to new people, and so spread the Dharma around the world. And in this way, the monastics were to both memorize the teachings and try to retain them faithfully and pass them down to the present day. Now, the Buddha then eventually, after a long life, at around age 80, he died of natural causes, and this would have been around the year 400 BCE, according to the best scholarly evidence we have now. And after having died, he was, as was done with powerful and important people in India, his body was cremated on a funeral pyre. The remains were taken and they were distributed around the area to important people and groups, and interred in funeral mounds which are known as stupas. And eventually some of them were redistributed at various different times, but these stupas do remain around the world, and some of them are claimed to retain remains of the historical Buddha. Whether they really do or not is a separate question. what comes down to us as Buddhism nowadays are teachings and practices that stem from the teachings that Siddhartha Gautama came up with 2,500 years ago. And in the intervening centuries and millennia, these teachings have been reinterpreted and renovated many, many times. It's something of a historical question of interpretation, how we understand Siddhartha Gautama's place, how we understand him as a person, and how we understand the early teachings of Buddhism. And if you're interested in early Buddhism as a subject, I have an earlier video on that topic, and I'll leave a link here up on the screen in case you're interested. I'd suggest taking a look at it. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, please take a look at my Patreon page. It's linked down below in the show notes. And consider if you want to join us. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.